Hello and welcome to the latest webinar in the Elemental Talk series. As part of the Future Leaders program, our topic for this special session is behavioural science, saving the planet with mind power, the role of behavioural science in achieving carbon neutrality. Your chair for today, my name is Jim McClelland. I'm founder and editor of SustMeme, home to both the magazine and the top 500 rankings. Joining me on the panel this afternoon are Rory Sutherland, Vice Chairman Ogilvy UK and founder of the behavioural science practice there, and Jordan Buck, Senior Consultant with the behavioural science practice at Ogilvy Consulting. It's all live with a Q&A to finish. So pop your questions on. You should see a tab called Ask a Question. The clue's in the name at the bottom or side of your screen. If you want to click that and type them in, we'll have Q&As at the end. You pose them, I'll ask them, they'll answer them. So today's webinar, a bit of background, instigated by Tinny Reeves of Ogilvy and the Future Leaders program. It's being hosted and produced by Elemental, elementalexpo.com. That's the online community for professionals focused on innovation in heat, water, air and energy, the vital elements within the built environment now and in the future. Future Leaders, launched in April this year. It's an industry-wide initiative designed to equip, develop and promote the next generation of leaders and influencers, those responsible for addressing the emerging green skills gap, mainstreaming low carbon technologies, achieving climate goals, delivering against sustainability objectives for years to come. So they have a lot to do. Reaching out across the sectors to welcome participation from all stakeholders, Future Leaders seeks to amplify new voices in a low carbon world. The program is designed to ensure our industry has the right people in place to drive organizations onwards towards net zero in the emerging green economy. So that's whetted your appetite. The next program of FLP starts in September. There are limited places available. So as they say, don't delay, book today. You'll find out more on the Future Leaders cohorts on the Elemental website. There's a tab at the top in the menu bar, I think. You should be able to read about that. And a novelty post-lockdown, you can meet some of the Future Leaders in person at the Installer Show taking place in Coventry, 28th to 30th September. So see you there. Right, background done. Now, moving forward, getting creative with the climate agenda. The context of our discussion today is going carbon neutral. 2 years ago, 2019, the UK became the first major economy in the world to pass into law a requirement to bring all greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. That's the date. So today, we're exploring the role of behavioural science in helping us work towards that target date and achieve those climate goals. We're talking aspiration, guilt, cognitive dissonance, bridging the intention gap, onto nudge theory. So let's meet our panelists and invite them to share some opening insights. So briefly, who are you? What is behavioural science? So first, Jordan, can you give us a brief overview, please, of what we actually mean by behavioural science, or BS?
Awesome, thanks, Jim. So I'd say behavioural science is really all about understanding human beings, so understanding what drives our behaviours, our actions, our motivations, and using that understanding in order to sort of change behaviour or change motivations in some way. So it's really understanding what actually drives people at a sort of fundamental level, and then how can we change the environment, or how can we make kind of tweaks or larger scale changes that's going to impact people's choices and decisions that they make on a day-to-day basis. And I think, to me, behavioural science really allows us to expand our possible solution set. So it looks beyond the kind of simple traditional rational answers to things and problems, and looks to perhaps more psychological solutions that can be just as effective, if not more effective, and often can be kind of small, perhaps even inexpensive changes that lead to large impacts on behaviour. And a lovely analogy that I'm sure I've stolen from Rory is that of the broken binoculars. And what we say is that we've tended to see the world through two broken lenses. And the first of those lenses is that of neoclassical economics. So economic man says people weigh up the options, they make the optimal decision, and they maximize their utility. So as a basic example, you put the price up of something and demand is going to go down. So we see the world through an economic lens, and we've also tended to see the world through the other lens, which is traditional market research. So this is the idea that people have introspection into how they behave, why they behave that way, how they would behave in the future. Therefore, we can just ask them, why do you do that? What made you perform that behavior? Would you perform a certain behavior in the future if we did X, Y, and Z? And we can therefore design this perfect environment and this perfect world whereby we get people to do exactly what we want them to do in order to achieve sort of sustainable goals in this case. But we know that these two aren't the case. These two just don't always apply. And a great example that, Rory, I feel like I'd be taking the words out of your mouth if I talk through it, but it's that the energy drink. I don't know if you want to talk this one through.
If you take Red Bull, yeah, my argument is that there are far more good ideas out there that you can post-rationalize than good ideas you can pre-rationalize. And so one of the things we're absolute devotees of is experimentation. And there's abundant evidence throughout human behavior of cases where people do things which they never wanted to do in advance. So the classic case I always give is Red Bull. If you wanted to compete with Coca-Cola and you'd said, well, okay, if we want to compete with Coke, we need a drink that tastes nicer than Coke, costs less than Coke, and comes in a really big container so people get great value for money. And if you market researched it, that's what everybody would say. And yet the most successful attempt to compete with Coke in 50 years comes in a tiny can, it costs a fortune, and it tastes disgusting. And they actually researched the taste, and people, the company who researched Red Bull, a company that only researches the tastes of carbonated beverages, so they've got a lot of experience in this. They said, this is the worst drink we've ever researched. Normally people say things like, oh, it's not really for me. People literally said, I wouldn't drink this piss if you paid me to. But, and here's the big but, if you recontextualize it or reframe it as a drug rather than as a drink, all those qualities, high price, small dose, weird taste, turn a weakness into a strength. Suddenly, by reframing the context, people judge the thing in an entirely different light, and it makes them a fortune, so much so that they can run a Formula One team for the lols, effectively. And there are cases like this in the environmental movement, interestingly. If you're talking to fundamentalist Christians in the United States, and you talk about environmentalism, basically they see it as a lot of hippies practicing free love, and they don't like the idea. If you talk to them about stewardship, which is a familiar biblical concept, they actually become very receptive. So the same thing presented in different ways fundamentally drives a completely different meaning, and as a result, a completely different emotional response, and as a result, a completely different behavior. And so you can't have the aspiration of most technocrats is for context-free decision-making. Mm-hmm. And our basic claim is you can't do that because there's always context, and the context always affects the meaning, and the meaning affects the emotional response. And because our behavior is mostly emotionally driven, attempts at effectively stripping out the messy bits from human behavior are doomed to fail.
Excellent.
That's it.
Excellent. Really nice example to start us off. And what you said, Jordan, about the kind of people drivers, changes, tweaks, nudges, solution sets beyond the rational into the reframing. So if we take some of this introduction, Rory, to BS, and then if I could ask you broad brush strokes, just give us a flavor of how it can help us down the road to being carbon neutral. So if you can make some linkages for us, please, to the climate agenda now.
Okay, the first thing is it can't do the whole job on its own. Okay, well, I mean, unless you take a very, very broad definition of what we can do, I don't know what I can do to prevent China's large-scale investment in coal energy. Now, admittedly, that will require some form of persuasion. So I suppose you could actually claim that's within our remit. But that's something that has to happen at a large governmental level. What we're mostly talking about here is voluntary human action, which alone I don't think is sufficient. I'll be honest, but maybe necessary, even if it's not sufficient. And one of the things I always look at is this, that most government and most centralized organizations tend to be effectively, I mean, as Richard Thaler, the Nobel Prize winning behavioral economist, said, he said, if you go to Washington, D.C., it's basically run by lawyers who occasionally take advice from economists. No one else interested in helping out the lawyers need apply. And so government tends to default with legislation first, economic incentives second, and persuasion or encouragement or, storytelling, if you want to go very broad, they tend to leave that till last. Now, I would argue you don't have to be a nutter libertarian to argue that whatever you think the ratio of those three things should be, that's the wrong way round to approach the problem. We should see what people are willing to do voluntarily. And then when that fails, we should perhaps resort to a little bit of bribery or inducement financially. And if that fails, maybe we have to actually introduce some legislation about it. But I'll give you an example of one of my arguments is that there are certain things, by the way, you can achieve through persuasion that you can't realistically in a democratic country achieve through compulsion. And that's because compulsion generally requires you to write laws which are blunt instruments. Economic incentives tend to operate across the board, which means they're blunt instruments. Now, I wrote a piece for The Spectator which just said, I think electric cars are a better idea than people think. Okay. And unfortunately, the sub-editor, when you're a journalist, you don't write the headline. Nobody knows this. So occasionally you get a lot of people shouting at you saying, I can't believe you said that. You go, I don't write the headlines, mate. The sub-editor writes the headlines. And the headline basically said why you should buy an electric car, which wasn't what I was saying. I was saying why I should buy an electric car, which is that range anxiety in a country with 240 volt power and very high population density isn't really a problem. Range anxiety is an issue in the United States. If you're on I-40 going through New Mexico and there's one charging point every 90 miles, you're going to get scared. In Britain, you just turn off the motorway and find a pub 3 miles. It's seriously, I mean, you know, it's seriously not a problem in a densely populated country. Okay. Now, my point I'm making there is I don't think everybody should buy an electric car. That would be what legislation tries to achieve. I think people where an electric car is highly appropriate to their needs, wants, and desires should buy more of them. But I think if you didn't drive anywhere except once a month when you drove to Newcastle and back in a day, slightly peculiar circumstances, but there are people in those kind of circumstances, I don't think you should buy an electric car, right? Okay, I don't think you should be penalised for owning a petrol car necessarily. What we do need to do is encourage as many people who are on the margin or for whom it makes sense to do so to begin with. Now, the point I make, here's an example, okay, where persuasion can get people to do things which you can't really achieve through financial incentives and legislation. I think it's a good idea if you put your washing machine, your dishwasher, and your tumble dryer on late at night rather than in the middle of the day, because the electricity generated at those times is much, much cleaner, and the incremental wattage you're using is much more likely to come from nuclear or renewables than it is at 5 o'clock in the afternoon when you may actually require someone to turn on a dirty power station. Now, so it's desirable for people to shift the use of those appliances where time of use isn't really, you can't make people watch TV at 4 o'clock in the morning, okay? That's not realistic, okay? But you can get people to put their tumble dryers on at 10 o'clock in the evening. You know, some of them even come with one of those little delay things, so you can delay the start by 4 hours. Now, that's a desirable behavior. You don't need everybody to do it because you achieve the effect if quite a lot of people do it, because you've removed peaks from electricity consumption. You've removed the spikes, right? Now, if you try and incentivize it through the price mechanism or you try and make it compulsory, you run against a problem, which is someone says, well, that's great for me because I live in a block of flats and my washing machine is directly above my neighbor's bedroom. Okay, so if that hits the spin cycle every night at 2 o'clock in the morning, they're going to come around and punch me in the face. So I can't do it. Or another person says, great idea, but I work nights. I don't want to leave my house with the tumble dryer on because it might catch fire, right? And there are always people who are exceptions who now, if you use economic incentives, you penalize those people unfairly. If you use legislation, you demonize those people unfairly. The great thing with persuasion is everybody with a good reason can opt out. And therefore, you can encourage behaviors which merely need to be adopted at scale, but don't have to be universal. And what state activity tends to do is it tends to try and solve the problem at a top-down, universal. There's a great book, the great book called Seeing Like a State by an anarchist writer called James C. Scott, which is an argument as to why many, many central things fail, because they attempt to come up with a one-size-fits-all policy. The great thing with persuasion is you can say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I don't do it because unfortunately our neighbor lives underneath our washing machine, right? And everybody goes, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, no, that makes sense, okay? The second you start introducing these blunter instruments, you can't introduce policies simply because of the 10% of people whom they'd unfairly penalize. You know, it's unfair to make, you know, to penalize people for using petrol who in their particular circumstances are being perfectly sensible in operating still an internal combustion engine vehicle would be silly. And so the vital point about this is that in some ways our requirement to use legislation and economic incentives actually makes us less ambitious than we should be, because the only things we can actually implement are the things where it's Pareto optimal for everybody, and there are very few of those interventions.
That's a very nice point, suggesting that we're effectively coming the wrong way up the street by going legislation first. And I think we will come on to the question of choice and those who potentially don't have a choice, depending on how we frame the options. But you've brought us nicely into the middle section, which are labeled challenges and conflicts, and you can see where we're going with that. I want to zoom in on the specifics, look at the obstacles, the issues, and ask you to define the psychological challenge a bit. You know, I'm saying mind power, we all have minds, so why won't we use them to save the planet? So if I could come to you, Jordan, first for this bit and say, well, as it just suggested, it'd be lovely if we had a one-size-fits-all solution, if it were that simple, but we don't. So could you explain for us, please, how and why the challenge is different for consumers, for example, and corporations? They're all people, they're all on the same planet. So what's the disconnect, for example, with those two communities?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. My perspective would be that we often can tend to view kind of companies and corporations like they are people. And actually, the things that we've kind of evolved to feel, and we know that influences our behavior, doesn't necessarily impact a large corporation in the same way. And I think shame might be a good example to bring up. So I think we often feel like, you know, because it would be personally so impactful if I were to feel a certain way, if something is deeply culturally unacceptable, far less likely to do it. And I think we forget that actually, I suppose it's looking at personal kind of forces or levers versus market forces or levers. And if the market force is saying, you know what, people are just going elsewhere because they don't like this, businesses are going to be far quicker to change than if people are like, I don't like Amazon, I don't agree with their policies and how they treat their workers, for example, or what they do to the climate, but I'm still going to buy it because it's just great for my life. And I think those kind of impacts, it's interesting separating those out. I saw a good talk recently, and it was saying shaming a coal company, for example, is going to be limited effectiveness because they're a coal company. There's a limited amount that they can do to change themselves. So maybe it's like the campaign against the banks that are investing in it, or getting the people, the consumers, to choose different suppliers. So I think those are two sort of interesting ones to think about. I think also it's interesting when the public do have a sort of backlash to companies, because I'm not saying those forces don't work. I think it's just interesting in the context in which businesses will change. And one that really struck me recently was Brewdog. And Brewdog's sort of saying we have some great sustainability policies. It's all about a better planet, better people, really lovely mission statements and everything. But when actually there's parts of the company that just don't align with that, people really call it out. And I think it's nice to see companies progressing towards sort of statements of intention, especially around the climate and carbon neutrality. And I think it's important that those companies are going to be held to account, rather than them being sort of meaningless statements that all companies are making and then don't sort of follow through on.
Absolutely, some nice points. And I think in that the divestment movement's interesting, where it's personal savers, pension funds, global institutions taking money out of undesirables. Typically coal is a classic example. Of course, coal companies don't move out of the business overnight, but funding's less available, interest rates are worse, the risk, the insurance, the climate for them financially gets more difficult, and the financial incentives are tougher. So I think there's an interesting alignment in some cases there with it's kind of follow the money, you know, in terms of individual and institutional lever pulling. So, and Rory, if I could come to you then in this middle section. So if just for a minute, just please forget all the good news and success stories around BS. Just park those for a moment. Instead, when it comes to going carbon neutral, can you lay out the perception issues, the barriers, the myths, the misunderstandings that slow progress, inhibit adoption, technology and lifestyle? In other words, what's our problem? Just give us a taste of what's wrong. Why doesn't it work now?
I'll give you a lovely example of this, which is if you want people to change their behavior, okay, it's a mixture quite often of innovation and marketing. And I don't think it's a coincidence, okay, that if you take Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, okay, and you could go back to Thomas Alva Edison, okay, those people were not just great inventors. They were fantastic. I mean, I'm going to use the word neutrally, hucksters, okay. They were fantastic at kind of changing the weather and effectively creating extraordinary excitement around what they were doing. And they were salesmen. Right? Absolutely pure and simple. Now, what quite often happens, and I'm going to give a perfect example from environmentalism here. I think if you look at solar panels have never had their Elon Musk or their Steve Jobs. Okay. Now, some of the cleverest people in the world, undoubtedly, when I was a kid, the general view was that solar panels, I'm terribly sorry, the phone's, Christine, could you just pick that up? Solar panels basically worked in Arizona or the Sahara Desert, but they were useless for the UK. And over the last 30, 40 years, some of the cleverest people in the world have basically made them thinner, lighter, cheaper to manufacture, inordinately more efficient, to a point where they're actually quite significant in terms of providing energy. But here's the problem, okay? No one actually has put similar intelligence into how you actually persuade people to buy them. Now, the assumption is if I want to power my home with solar energy, I've got to make a one-off commitment of 20 to 30,000 pounds to attach an enormous array of these things to the roof of my house, immovably, okay, attached to a house which I might be planning to sell in the next 5 years, okay, and with a 1, 2, 3% chance of total catastrophe, where I install the whole thing and then my local electricity board says we won't credit you for the power you feed into the grid, or, you know, my roof starts collapsing or something like that, okay. Now, so a huge amount of intelligence has been put into the product, but no intelligence has been put into how to sell it. Now, I think if you want people to migrate to solar power and you had a modular solution where you could spend £500 at a time, and you could start off with a solar powered shed, and then you'd have a solar powered summer house and conservatory, and then you'd have a solar powered car because you'd install 4 more panels and use it to charge your car. Okay. I think people will do that, because what we know from psychology is that people hate making massive, irreversible bets with a small chance of catastrophe. Okay, if there's any kind of transaction that humans really hate engaging in, it's like buying a car without a test drive. Okay, it's absolute anathema to all our evolved instincts for around risk. Okay, so if you could design the purchase decision with some of the same intelligence that's been put into designing the product, you can't even buy them from John Lewis. There isn't even a normal brand I can go to who say, yeah, solar power, you can trust us, we'll sort you out. I have to go to some weird organization and then spend 3 years studying electrical engineering before I can make sense of what's going on. Okay. So the point is there's a marketing component to innovation alongside a technical component.
I think that's a very nice point. And I think, and I mean, I'm a sustainability champion, but the sustainability community was notoriously squeamish about mixing it with sales and marketing. They were uncomfortable potentially about greenwashing and all sorts of dangers of misrepresentation or overhype or something. So I think my example always is like energy efficiency. I think if I say, well, efficiency, you're not using a word that's the language of human attributes, for example. So if I would say Jordan's an efficient man, I have to explain in one context, because that's not a people word. What, he pairs his socks, he used to alphabetize his CD. What do you mean by efficient? But of course, the way of marketing most efficient gadgets is that they're smart and intelligent. Why? Because that's the language of human. If I say Jordan's smart and intelligent, I might be wrong, but at least it's a sentence people can understand. So I think using that kind of people, but historically, green with its origins in science.
So if you go back to religion,
didn't use some of that language and are wary of it, and therefore the efficiency cell, for example, was very tough.
It's no good just having Jesus. You've got to have St. Paul. Yeah. What I mean is St. Paul was instrumental in making Christianity as a movement scale. And he did a lot of things around diet, religion, dress, language, which made the whole thing jump beyond being a niche interest, a small Jewish sect, to being widely adopted. Okay. And the point about this is that quite often the language we use to signal to each other within niche groups is deeply inimical to the language that will actually get you adopted by the wider populace.
Absolutely.
Also true of the behaviors. You know, one of the things I said to Extinction Rebellion is I said, look, this is a very extreme level. I said, don't, I don't know, this is a family show. Don't spray the F word on a war memorial. Okay. I bet it feels great at the time. It looks great to the other protesters who you're with. But on television, it loses you thousands and thousands of people who might otherwise be sympathetic. So quite often, I think, you know, if you're trying to impress other electrical engineers, you'll use the language of electrical engineering. And you'll be very keen to talk about your wattage. But until you've translated that into language which resonates with ordinary people, the other thing which gets into slight ethical territory is, does it matter why people engage in a clean behavior so long as they do? So if people buy electric cars because they do 0 to 60 in 3 seconds and they look really cool, does that matter? Because, I mean, one of the interesting things that does bother me about some of these movements becoming highly moralized, okay, is Puritanism never scales, okay? It always remains a sect, okay? And the problem you have, I think, I'll put it very bluntly, okay? I think this business of trying to moralize political belief is a bit dodgy, because if you're old like me, one of the things you say is, if you had to look at a list of attributes for a human being based on your life experience, okay, and you had to look for something which was a proxy measure for whether or not they were a decent human being, actually their political beliefs wouldn't even make the top 50, would they? Okay, there isn't actually that much correlation between people's ostensible political opinions and whether they're basically decent people, I would argue. Young people tend to believe that there is, but I think they're wrong. I've worked with, left wing, right wing people who are nice and left wing people who are total assholes, to be absolutely honest. And I think that business of making it a them and us thing is slightly limiting in some ways, because you end up signaling to a small group of people, actually what you've got to do is you've got to win over Clarkson. Now, the interesting thing there is that when the point of soap is that it massively improved human lifespan and human health and hygiene, okay, but was soap sold on that basis? Mostly not. They didn't say wash with Pear soap and help prevent a cholera outbreak. You sold people soap on the basis that they'd smell better, they'd be more attractive to potential life partners. You sold soap on a load of other extra social status, okay? The Duchess of so-and-so always washes with so-and-so, so-and-so. And actually, one of the things I'd argue is that always wanting to drive behavior through the pure high-end intention might be a mistake. That actually, someone wrote to me bizarrely from an oil rig in the South China Seas, and they always said they thought that carbon was a bad message and that air cleanliness and air quality was a much more salient message to sell environmentalists. Now, it isn't the real reason any more than the real reason that the Lever organization wanted to sell soap was to improve people's mating prospects. But actually, if you can find sideline reasons, care about insects, I don't know if you talk to right-wing people about rewilding, right, they're right up for it, right? Particularly if you say, and you'll have to introduce wolves, right-wing people go, wolves, they're like Uber dogs, I could do with wolves. So depending on, the argument is, do you need to make this entirely about purity of intention? Because you could argue if the behavior is positive, who cares what the intention is?
There's especially as we're looking to scale, and importantly, a lot of sustainability issues, we've got bags of innovation, it's just not scaling.
It's not scaling.
And you are talking about selling it under sizzle, and that is where some of the deeper greens get more uncomfortable with methods potentially to do that. But as I say, I think always one of the best arguments for a lot of sustainability is the business case. Why should we be uncomfortable about saying actually it'll make you more money or it'll save you money or it's cheaper? And why an awful lot of organizations investing in ESG, it's not for the higher intentions and the virtue signaling. Actually, it's because it's lower risk, it's going to make them better returns and things like that. So now we're getting perhaps to the I'm wary of using the phrase tipping point, but now we're getting into some of those scale scenarios. Cost and the business case, of course, is easier to put across. And as you say, then whether they're doing it for the so-called right reasons or not becomes potentially a moot point. But so it moves us nicely kind of onto the third section, and I'm keen to move it along because we've got a bunch of questions from the cohort, and we'll be getting some hopefully coming in as well from the live audience. So if we're moving to this last bit, which is positives and hopes and reasons to be cheerful, so we're looking at how behavioral science can unleash the power of the mind to enable the global community to decarbonize decade by decade towards net zero, make it all happen. So, Jordan, if I come to you first, then let's have a quick 5 minutes each, and then we'll go to the questions from the audience. Jordan, so if we're going to engage consumers and get them to make this shift into a carbon neutral mindset, we understand the principle. How do you make it happen in practice? Can you give us some real world examples how perceptions get changed for the better? How are we going to do it?
Yeah, I think one lovely, quite simple framework is called the EAST framework, and it makes something easy, attractive, social, and timely. And all of those, I think, work really well. To touch on one, just making it easy, I think it's exactly what we were saying before. We have the impression that in order to get people to change their behavior, we need to motivate them. So we need to educate them and persuade them. And actually, I think what we find with a lot of sustainability behaviors is that people are kind of motivated. They're kind of behind it. They agree with it in principle. But if it's just not the easiest thing to do, then they don't do it. And it's something we call the intention action gap. So a lot of people say they kind of agree with the principle and they would like to do more. But actually, when it comes down to it, if the recycling bin is way over there, you're just going to put it in the normal bin or whatever that behavior might be. If we can make it just the easier choice, then it's not because necessarily people are like, I am doing this because I'm so devoted to the planet. It's just the easier or more default mode of thinking, if you like. And we did a really interesting project actually for Recycle for London. And it was looking at how do you get people to, this is another recycling example, but how do you get people to recycle more? And the traditional mode of thinking is that, well, we put a persuasion campaign up and get people to care about recycling and the environment. And what we did through our research was actually found that a key problem in this demographic and flats in London is they just didn't have a recycling bin. And actually, how do you make it easier to recycle? The campaign becomes getting a recycling bin and giving out sort of different types of recycling hooks, making it easier in home for people to do their recycling. And suddenly you're getting at the actual blockage rather than what you assume through kind of traditional modes of thinking is a motivation or educational challenge. And I think it's looking at those other kind of levers. So whether that is making it easy, making it something more sociable. So, that social contagion, things spreading around the community, this is the done thing. Or whether it's just other psychological levers that I think we really need to move towards rather than getting people up to date with sustainability.
Nice.
And more than that, there's a double win, because the assumption, the standard model of human behavior is that attitude drives behavior, but behavior drives attitude. So if you can get people to recycle merely because it's an easy and convenient thing to do, as a product of their behavior, they will adopt attitudes which are more well disposed to recycling, because we often actually reverse engineer our attitudes to fit in with our behavior. I think Bob Dylan says it. What is it? We do what's convenient and then we kind of repent. The point is that actually, if you can get people to, when I buy an electric car for selfish reasons, I will suddenly start, purely for the fun of it, chiding my friends who still have petrol cars. Okay, and as a product of that totally post-rationalized behavior, other behaviors will emerge with that attitude. But often you actually get the behavior first and then the belief comes second.
The more feedback you can give people about those positive impacts as well, the more impactful it is. And I think it's a prime example where we have a lack of positive feedback and a lack of negative feedback. So the positive feedback being a lot of actions that help towards carbon neutrality are the opposite of an action. They are an inaction. It's not taking that long haul flight. It's not doing that action that's going to cause lots of carbon emissions. And you don't get recognized both by yourself and by others for the actions that you don't take as much as for the actions that you do take. So I think it's thinking, how can we build in those positive reinforcements for things people are doing? And also, I suppose, showing the negative consequences of the behaviors that are bad. And often, I suppose, we think about impacts that are, it's me, it's now, it's here. And climate change is just the perfect storm where it's not me, it's not now, it's not here. This is going to, impact people halfway across the world in 5 years' time. That's the sort of perception. So I think it's bringing those home that both really help.
Excellent. Nice point. And if I'm going to rush us along a little bit because I can see the questions queuing up. We've got one here. We've got a bunch from the future leaders. Do type them in the ask a question box. So lastly, Rory, just before we go to all the questions from the audience, Rory, quickly, I'm going to put you under some time pressure. What might success look like, thinking with your rose-tinted spectacles on, for a BS-enabled net zero future? So paint us a picture of the carbon neutral utopia that awaits us if we want it enough. So just give us a vision of where we could be going in this kind of climate-friendly BS-enabled future.
I think we saw a vision. Funnily enough, I think what we should do is spend a lot of time looking at behavior under lockdown and the adoption of things like video conferencing. And the really interesting thing about that is that will have I think that will have a significant and lasting effect on an awful lot of travel, which was done through obligation rather than necessity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what was interesting is that I think a lot of human behavior was a lot of business travel in particular, by the way, and commuting. It was a bit like dressing for dinner in the 19th century. Okay, it was performative. You had to do it because everybody else did. And I think that lesson that in networks there's the opportunity for finding new equilibria. The difficulty is in getting from one equilibrium to a new equilibrium, to a new normative state, without requiring a pandemic to drive that change, is a really, really interesting question.
Excellent, nice point. So that takes us through to the questions. So we've got them queuing up. So I'm going to hurry you on. I'm going to fire the questions out now, panel. And if you'd like to just put a hand up and take them rather than me working them around both of you repeatedly. So the first one actually we're starting with from the Future Leaders Programme is a challenging one. So we're going to start with a tough one in a sense. So Richard's asking, we touched on some of this earlier, it's the poorest being affected most by climate change, not just globally where the consequences are arguably more severe, but here in the UK too, he says. Most people can't afford a Tesla, or some of them are aspirational lifestyle choices. So how can BS mobilise everyone, including the least advantaged, to go carbon neutral, especially when feeding their kids will be further up the list of priorities they might be faced with eat or heat dilemmas? So mobilising everyone. I wonder if you could comment first on that. Tough question from the future leaders to start.
Who goes first? Jordan, do you want to go?
Yeah, so one thing I would just say on that is that whilst there are some actions, behaviours, products that are just more expensive, and I think over time those things do become cheaper, and it's something that I think we should work towards, and it is difficult to combat that. I think there are also other behaviours, actions, even products that are actually going to save you money. Mm-hmm. So, for example, we do a lot of work with food waste, reducing food waste across the UK. Yep. And it's not something people think of as contributing to the climate crisis. Actually, it's a huge, huge contributor. And if you reduce your food waste, you're saving yourself money. It's literally the opposite. And I think there's a lot of examples where, whether it's food waste or something else, actually it's the just time spent in kind of planning certain behaviors or thinking about things in a certain way that can lead to money saving and time saving for yourself, and also sustainable outcomes. And so perhaps there's also the question of how can we encourage people to perform those kind of behaviors. So if we're thinking about food waste, planning weekly shops or whatever it might be, that aren't costly in themselves, but can have a positive impact on people and on the planet, rather than just the things that people can buy.
Nice. And Rory, have you got any thoughts on mobilizing everyone?
The one suggestion I was going to make is one useful thing that government or central entities could do is give people a choice architecture, a menu from which they can choose. Because at the moment, we're telling everybody to do everything, and it's impossible. Yeah. Okay. And, when faced with 20, it's a bit like a Chinese restaurant menu. There's just too much choice. So you end up going, oh, blow it, I'll have set meal B. Right. Now, or in the case of the Chinese, in this case, you decide not to do anything at all because you can't decide what to do. I think if you gave everybody a list of 8 really big things they can do, 8 medium-sized things they can do, and 8 small things they can do, I commit not to fly for a year, would be a big thing. Or now some people will already tick that box because they haven't got much money and they're not flying, or don't own a car, or own an electric car, or whatever it might be. If you could give people a list of 8 big things and they could choose 3, and they could choose 3 medium-sized things out of a list of 8, and they could choose 3 small things out of a list of 8. Now what you've done is you've framed it in a way that most people go, well, I'm already doing 2 of these, so I might as well just do the other one. Okay. You've framed it in a way that's manageable in behavioral terms. At the moment, the way it's perceived is as a mass onslaught of largely actually driven by self-denial, because signaling through self-denial. Now, another way of improving the environment while also improving the quality of life is just creating social norms around do less, but when you do something, do it better. Yep. Buy far fewer higher quality clothes, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good example, and I think that's in one of our questions from the audience as well about that. So yeah, really picking up some nice points. So Alex asks from the Future Leaders, their question is, do you have any examples of strategies likely to result in more durable long-term behavior changes? So really, I guess I'm putting words in their mouth, but challenging you that, okay, people might change for a short while, you know, it might be temporary, and then they slip back into business as usual, or people into old or bad habits, however we describe those. So how do you make it stick? How do you make lasting change, behavioral change?
I mean, the big forces, I suppose, are social copying. You know, in other words, social norms are a kind of gravitational force in human behavior. Habit, you know, ritual almost, is another really potent force. So harnessing those, undoubtedly, you know, if you can actually make something habitual and you make it normalized, then generally you remove a huge amount of the friction around the behavior. We've evolved for perfectly logical evolutionary reasons to do what everybody else does and to do what we've done before. And so that strikes me as as something we just need to understand much better. If you look at a really successful government campaign, which was successful partly because it was voluntary, opt-out pensions. Okay, by default, we're all going to sign up for this pension, but if you want to opt out, you can. Okay, now they thought that they get about 70% sign up. I think it ended up being around 90. And that's an example where you can, and I'm also interested in things like temporary legislation, which is, I'm interested in things like car-free days. Because I think if you said, okay, what we're going to do, we're not going to legislate for in perpetuity. We're just going to legislate for 4 car-free Sundays a year. Okay. What will then happen is that you then say, at the end of this year, we'll have a discussion. Did people like it? And quite often people will discover benefits to car-free days, which they never actually envisaged in advance.
Yeah, I think that's yeah, I mean, we saw the benefits of those car-free days in the center of Paris, for example. You know, really high profile, and Paris, of course, you know, famously busy in many respects for cars. And so the images that were shared, of course, were quite exciting to people, and the beauty of Paris shone through without the cars, not least. So if I could ask you, Jordan, to pick up that about keeping things durable, but also I've got another question from Tinny here, asking about how does design behavior differ from end user behavior, which is more important, the way we design or the way we adopt? So I wonder if you talk about durability, but also about, if you like, potentially building it in with design. So I wonder if you could do 2 questions for me there. Making it last, but also if you had to choose one, which is more important, design behavior or adoption behavior?
Yeah, and I think just to build on the sort of durability long term, I would definitely agree that the default, making something an opt-out, is one of the most sort of powerful behavioral options in the toolkit, if you like. So if there are ways that we can make it, you know, the default that you have to ask if you want a bag, or your pensions are defaulted into being ESGs, or the carbon offsetting as the default on flights and you have to opt out, whatever the option might be, I think those are the really, really powerful ones, that the choice is still there. Everyone's sort of free choice is still withstanding, but it has a huge impact on people's behavior. And we see it with donation rates as well. So when you get organ donations between countries that are opt-in, countries that are opt-out, the difference is like absolutely enormous. So I think the more we can build those kind of choices in, where people don't actively have to go to any effort at all, I think the better the long-term solutions will be.
Yeah, and I think we've seen just flipping the opt-in, opt-out. We've seen obviously with various web options, as soon as the default is in or out, as soon as it's reversed, it's very interesting the way, to the degree to which people are accepting of having the opposite default. We've seen that, I think, with a few.
I mean, the 2 are inseparable. Design thinking at its highest level is exactly what we practice. And you know, some great academics have talked about design. Of course, is a very unfortunate word because people tend to think it means graphic design. If you know, it's one of those words like psychology, by the way. Psychology only got taken seriously, as Daniel Kahneman remarked, when it rebranded itself as behavioral economics. You know, which is a tragedy because psychology is is arguably much more interesting, deeper discipline, but it had to call itself behavioral economics before you could talk about it at board level. And design is a problem because of that language, which is people tend to assume it means something aesthetic. Now, if you get it down to the whole principle of affordances, one of the things you start to notice is that there are desirable behaviors for which the world is not designed to offer such an affordance. And it's a really interesting one, which is I mean, one of the things we would talk to Google about is if Google made it easy or defaulted to local shopping, for example, to shopping from more local entities, and actually built geographical distance into the thing. Most people would then actually happily go along with the preset default. And so there is extraordinary power in some of these places to change behavior without people even being aware that anything's changed.
Yeah, that's nice.
The whole thing is that great thing that with Don Norman, you have a door. If you have a push pad on a door, nobody has to think about what you do with that door because it's clearly designed to be pushed. Yeah. And then you get those awful doors, which are kind of like you're supposed to push them, but there's a handle. And everybody has that brief moment of feeling like a mug. And you can undoubtedly design the environment. You can also, to answer another question or to tie in, status seeking, I think, is innate. Okay, I think we're sort of rivalrous. But the currencies we use to compete on status vary. Okay? Yep. And so, I mean, let's look at holiday taking, okay? What you see, and I don't think this was a product of the environmental movement at all, but weirdly, where's about the most fashionable place you can go on holiday as a Brit? Well, it used to be Machu Picchu, and now arguably it's Cornwall, right? Now, that's a case where Cornwall hasn't changed that much. It's quite a few fancy restaurants and so on. Mm-hmm. But the social meaning of if in my childhood you went to the West Country instead of going to Spain, it was viewed to be a compromise, not a choice. And now actually Cornwall's seen as a choice, not a compromise. And so these status currencies always change, and being able to harness them, okay, so that essentially the high status thing to do is also the cleaner thing to do. I mean, okay, we've seen a small revolution in clothing where premium vintage, okay. Yep. Now, actually, here's an interesting one, okay. Arguably, buying one Louis Vuitton bag environmentally ain't that bad because you're paying for a lot of meaning. And meaning doesn't require much carbon to generate. Okay, brand meaning is much cleaner as a thing of value to generate than actual. It's much better than producing 1,000 identical bags and selling them for $15.99. Okay. Secondly, because of the meaning, that item has value that probably lasts. What is it? 75% of the Rolls Royces ever built are still on the roads. Yeah. Okay, it actually means that you now have a second-hand market for the thing, so it doesn't go to landfill. And so actually, oddly, you can actually have commercial aims, status-seeking aims, and environmental aims, which aren't necessarily misaligned.
No, and it's interesting, especially taking that forward, we can also bring in ideas of repairable things of value that you keep, or amendable or modifiable or modular or etc. So in other words, your investment can be adapted because we're all now ever more aware of the need for flexibility and agility post-lockdown. It's changed an awful lot of things that we took for granted. So that kind of dynamic opportunity. And I think you've nicely queued up really one of the questions from the audience here, which is from Barry Desmond. If I might ask that of you then, Jordan, sort of taking on what Rory just said. So Barry asks, is there a way of shifting existing lifestyle values from consumption status model, as we're just talking, developed by advertisers, to a sustainable integrated value model be viewed as desirable by people? I think there's a slight suggestion there advertisers are not people, but I'm not quite sure.
No, I know exactly what's
that's just me taking Barry's literal words of it. But so how do we shift away from consumption status, to a more integrated value model? I think that's a nice question. So Jordan, I wonder if you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I think that it does come down to, as well as advertisers, it's like the brands behind the advertisers sort of thinking, well, what are we offering and what's the sort of place that we want to get to? And I think it does come back to, if you can show that you are achieving status or whatever the meaning behind the item is, because a lot of marketing is just inferring meaning onto items, and we buy items subconsciously because it signals something either to ourselves or it signals it to other people, and almost everything we buy has that kind of in mind or has that behind it, and that's sort of the power of brands. And I think the more that we can start to infer that meaning to be less about the consumption, and I've got the sort of the latest model or the most sort of powerful piece of kit and the biggest thing, towards kind of other sorts of signaling, I think that'd be really powerful. Rory, I don't know if you probably have more to say on it than I.
No, I mean, it's worth noting, by the way, that as an old guy, I'm going to be a bit cheeky about Gen Z here, because they're very happy going around by bicycle, okay, and they're very happy not owning a car. But I would argue that if you're Gen Z, and this is a really interesting question, the extent to which you are well traveled, particularly in long haul, let's be honest about this, okay? Imagine you're a Gen Z guy and you're going to a reasonably sophisticated party, and the only places you've ever been are like France and Britain, okay? You're going to be at a major reputational and arguably reproductive disadvantage to people in Gen Z who've been to Machu Picchu, okay? And that extent, we have to be quite conscious of this, because people weirdly, are very, very defensive of their own status-seeking actions and tend to be very, very dismissive of the status-seeking actions of people not like them. So, I just raised that question because, I always noticed amusingly that nearly all eco holidays involved a long haul flight. Okay. Because an eco holiday would be staying at home and sorting out and rewilding your garden. That's a
nice example, because the benefits of travel in terms of expanding your frame of reference and things. But it'll be interesting to see whether we'll follow on from our, as you say, our Zoom integrated experience of lockdown to more VR, and so we'll put goggles on to travel, and we won't actually make the flight, but we'll be able to have that conversation at the dinner party. So it'll be interesting to what degree our virtual experiences will be useful to us in that way. So I'm conscious we've got about 5 minutes left, and we've got a few questions, so I'm going to fire them at you. So there's one quick one from the Future Leaders. Emily asks, what effect can being more BS conscious have on workplace and staff? So that's a useful one. So in the workplace with staff, I suppose in the context of, climate goals, what effect can being BS conscious have?
I'd love to jump in there just with what the sort of biggest one that I see is that I think it just opens the solution space. So whether that's in terms of sort of just something internally with your staff, or whether it's thinking about sustainability and what you kind of can achieve and the ideas that you can put out there, I think it just really opens the doors to a lot more that you wouldn't get to with traditional modes of thinking. And I think it's that ability to kind of think, this might not make traditional sense. I might not get taught this in business school, but let's test it and let's try it. And actually, it might be even more effective. And to me, that's like the single biggest sort of benefit.
Yeah, so it's fair to say that behavioral science is not an exact science like physics, because physics can be an exact science because atoms don't get into a bad mood, okay? Atoms, are basically obey laws which are both universal and eternal, and people don't, okay? It's like Immanuel Kant, from the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made, okay? And so one of the things we would say is that we believe it's a science basically in that the main scientific lesson of behavioral science is you need to test far more than you think. And you also need to test things which don't necessarily make sense in advance, because our ability to predict what people will do is always inexact. And also people will often behave strangely. There are cases, for example, where, let me give you a lovely example of this, okay, where very logical economic ideas backfired. Disney produced, because they had far too much demand for the most popular rides, they gave people kind of jump the queue tickets.
Yep.
And depending on how popular the ride was, you'd need to use 5 of your allocation of tickets to jump the queue on Pirates of the Caribbean, and you'd only need 1 to go on, I don't know, some small little unexciting log flume, okay? And they thought, this is brilliant. We've created an economic solution to the problem because people will disproportionately go to the log flume to save their ticket resource. What people did was the opposite. They thought, this is the most expensive ride, so this is the one I have to go on. So it disproportionately made people actually crowd out the rides which were more popular to begin with. And so quite often, certain things in the price mechanism can actually backfire because people interpret it in the opposite way to the way you've assumed.
The law,
so actually, maybe Cornwall got cool because it got really expensive.
Yeah,
okay.
well,
Peloton was nothing. Peloton was an exercise bike with someone shouting at you until they tripled the prices.
Yeah, well,
that's everybody wanted one.
That's the Stella Artois reassuringly expensive kind of
exactly.
argument, and law of unintended consequences. Right, last couple of minutes. So I'm going to give you a 1-minute question each to finish. harsh. So from the audience, this one's yours, Jordan. Really, it's about accreditation and labels, I guess. Are frameworks like B Corp worth looking at, or is that going down the legislation route? So, and that's from Abby Lench. So if you could take that as labels, accreditation, is that the positive way to go, or is that in danger of slipping down the mandatory legislation kind of?
Interestingly, I'm very much in favour of the B Corp option existing, because it's not legislation, because it's giving a company, when it founds, a choice as to what its objectives are, and it frees you from that fiduciary duty simply to maximise shareholder value at the expense of everything else.
Yep.
I think the shareholder value movement is dumb, by the way. It's also intellectually inconsistent, because which shareholder over which time frame? Okay, do you give the same priority to a high frequency trading algorithm than you do to someone who's buying your stock to save for retirement? It's intellectually a nonsense to begin with, to be honest. So anything that frees you from that single, I do believe that all organizations should effectively have a multiple balance sheet. In other words, you have a duty to your shareholders, yes. You have a duty to your customers, yes. You have a duty to your employees, yes. And you have a duty to wider society. And it's in triangulating those four things that you create a great business. I don't think you'll create a lot of shareholder value if all you're fixated on is shareholder value. John Kay, book called Obliquity, wonderful economics professor and writer, Professor John Kay, his book Obliquity explains exactly why that is. You'll produce a better business if you have an oblique aim. You'll actually be more profitable than if you make profit your central aim.
Excellent. And the last question then, because Rory jumped in there. So Jordan.
Sorry, Jordan. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
sorry.
Right.
What Rory said.
Yeah, exactly. So Jordan, this is yours. Be quick there. So considering the challenges faced in achieving net zero impact through BS, is net positive too far? And that's from Harry Priya. So that's a good question to finish on. If we're just about getting our heads around net zero, is net positive over-egging it?
No. I absolutely don't think so. And I think it ties back to the previous question as well. I think the more we can make things like that, whether it's the B Corp certification, whether it's sort of achieving net positive, I think the more you can make those the kind of signal, and people have to keep up. So businesses, brands, companies have to keep up in order to not get left behind, the more successful they can be. And I think that's a really strong driver, that even if you're not going to proactively do it yourself, if all your competitors are doing this and you look bad for not having this or not aiming towards this, I think that is a really strong driver of especially business behavior. And I think if we can increase that kind of sense that, it's no longer acceptable to not drive this, just as I think it's no longer acceptable to not have a target towards kind of net zero or towards some kind of sustainability goal, the further we can push that norm, if you like, within industry, I think the better the outcome for everyone.
Nice point to finish on, embracing a more ambitious note. And I can see Rory nodding there in terms of you can see positive being acceptable beyond zero. Can you? We can go beyond zero.
This is called anchoring, which is that one of the dangers with targets is people tend to go there and then stop. And you could argue that we ain't going to solve the problem with 20% of the world going carbon neutral. We need net positive activities. But the cost isn't always all that high. I've just switched to green energy tariffs, and the price I pay as a premium for that is significantly modest, that I would have been prepared to go further, to be honest, if they'd offered me that option.
Well, maybe getting people on a ladder, as opposed to giving them one target, but getting them on a ladder and potentially walking them through it as it becomes more doable and costs come down, etc., is maybe a very positive vision of where we could be going between now and 2050. So we've not been able to answer all the questions, I'm afraid. Great thanks to Rory and Jordan for doing as many as they have in the time. I know I've rushed you through, but we could have gone on all afternoon. So it's just, we are now coming to the close. So a big thank you to you both, Rory and Jordan, for your sterling efforts, to Tinny Reeves at Ogilvy and Richard Cartledge from your Navigator, to the FLP cohorts, plus yourselves out there, the audience on Crowdcast, for your comments and questions. A reminder to check out elementalexpo.com, the online community for professionals focused on innovation, heat, water, air, and energy, the vital elements within the built environment now and in the future. Last plug, I said at the top of the show, but I'll repeat it in case you missed it at the beginning. The next Future Leaders program starts in September. Limited places, get booking. Hurry, hurry, hurry. So you can find out more about the current Future Leaders cohorts on the Elemental website, tab at the top, and meet some of them at the Installer Show in Coventry, 28th to 30th of September. So that's been it. We've had a gallop through. I'm sure there've been lots of insights to interest and entertain, but that's it for today. Thanks again, Rory and Jordan. I've been Jim McClelland, editor at SustMeme. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you all again soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you.